from this nice book. 150 glimpses of the Beatles, which so far I do recommend if you're a Beatles fan. It's a nice sort of every chapter is a different story. They're all very short. You can jump in and out easily. Pretty fun stuff. Number 40, in January 1964, the Ronettes came to London to headline their first British tour. Supported by a local group, the Rolling Stones. On their first night, a party was thrown for them by the Radio Luxembourg disc jockey Tony Hall at his home in Green Street, Mayfair, just down the road from where George and Ringo were living. George and Ringo are members of the Beatles. Okay. John, George, and Ringo, John is also a Beatle, were already there when the Ronettes came in. The Ronettes were aware of the fame of the Beatles since their arrival. They had heard of little else, but had still not heard their music. For their part, the three Beatles were mustard keen on the Ronettes with their lusty, yearning voices and shapely bodies. As the Ronettes entered, John, George, and Ringo made a beeline for them and showered them with praise. "You've got the greatest voice," George told Ronnie Bennett, the lead singer. "We loved it the first time we heard you." Generally thrifty with his compliments, John was similarly effusive. "Fucking great," he said. "They kept telling us how much they loved our long black hair and how our whole look blew them away," remembered Ronnie. "And we weren't exactly having a bad time ourselves." They all started dancing to records by the Ronettes. "Be My Baby," "Baby I Love You," "I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus." Over the course of the evening, the three girls enjoyed teaching the Beatles the latest dance moves from America. The pony, the jerk, the nitty-gritty. Usually a reluctant dancer, John proved eager for tuition from Ronnie. Every time we'd start to dance, John would come over and say, "I don't know if I've got this one yet, Ronnie. I may need some extra instruction." I'm reading this. This is like sight reading. It's just funny as I go along and I get tripped up. It didn't take me long to figure out that he liked me. At the same time, George was making it clear that he was similarly taken with Ronnie's elder sister, Estelle. "We were young and in a foreign country, so we decided to forget our boyfriends back home and have some fun," recalled Ronnie, whose highly strung boyfriend, the record producer Phil Spector, was safely back in America. Yes, if you're dating Phil Spector, the only safe place to keep him is definitely in another country with a whole ocean dividing you. Note that for future anyone who ends up dating someone like Phil Spector. As the night wore on, George and Estelle disappeared from the dance floor, and Ronnie agreed to let John take her on a tour of the house. She was impressed. There were antique vases and fine art in every room. Upstairs, John began trying all the door handles. It dawned on Ronnie that he was after a hidey hole. Just in more ways than one would think. John finally found one door open, so we walked in, but it was so dark, we didn't even notice that George and Estelle were already in there sitting on the bed. "Oops, sorry, guys," I said. They eventually found an empty room. Together they sat on a window seat, gazing out over a view of this fairy tale land of lights and towers that seemed to go on forever, as the mood became more intimate. "What's all this like for you?" asked Ronnie. "Well, there's a drought, and the window seat is killing my bum." "That's not what I meant. I meant being famous." "Oh, well, I see. Serious stuff. I'll need a smoke for this then." I'm not doing the accent. I'm sorry. I can't do it. They talked about fame. John remembered sitting in cafes with the other Beatles, fantasizing about the future. We'd sit there with our jam butties and tea saying, "When we get our record contract, everything's going to change. We'll have limousines and chauffeurs, and we'll never have to eat another jam butty as long as we live." Then we got our record contract. And you know what's happened? Nothing really changed. Nope. Turns out we were right. Everything did change. We got our limousines and our drivers, and now we've gone right off jam buddies. If I even think of them, I want to heave up. All this talk made Ronnie wonder whether John was one of these heavy brain people just like Phil. She could also tell that John liked her for more than just my voice. When he leaned over and started kissing me, I have to admit, he made me forget about Phil for a few seconds. Professionally, Ronnie had often sung about kissing. I'll make you happy, baby, just wait and see. For every kiss you give me, I'll give you 3. But so far, she had taken things no further. I know it might seem hard to believe now, but I hadn't done much more than kiss a guy on the lips until then, and that included Phil. Romance was everything, and sex was still a mystery. But the way things were going on that window seat, it didn't look like it was going to stay that way for long. As they kissed, John started moving his hands around in places I didn't even know I had. He then put them around her waist and tried to edge her towards the king-size bed. But at that moment, Ronnie's thoughts turned to Phil, and she suddenly dug her feet into the rug, causing John to topple over onto the floor. Do you think we could go back down to the party? She said. Estelle and Ronnie embarked on a series of double dates with George and John. Ronnie was intrigued by how starstruck the two Beatles were. Always wanting to know more about American singers and musicians. Tell us about the Temptations. What's Ben E. King really like? One night, George and John collected Estelle and Ronnie from the lobby of the Strand Palace Hotel. Caught off guard, John made the mistake of asking their mother, who was accompanying the girls, if she would like to come too. Her enthusiastic response came as a bitter disappointment. Dinner? Oh, that sounds fun. Let me get my purse. The evening proved awkward, not least for Ronnie. How can you say anything with your mother sitting around? And the worst part was that she didn't say a word the whole time. She just kept staring at us through the whole meal. Decades later, her mother confessed to Ronnie that she didn't care for the way these big grown men were really liking my little girls. I thought, well, what kind of life am I going to have now? It was, she thought, the most hurtingest night of my life. Towards the end of the month, Phil Spector arrived in town. Ronnie knew his presence would spell the end of their fun. He was bound to refuse to go clubbing, and he would certainly never let her go out without him. Phil never said anything, but Ronnie sensed that he didn't like the way that she had been spending so much time with the Beatles. Phil could be tricky that way. There's an asterisk and then a footnote. And the footnote says, and how? In 1968, soon after their marriage, he gave her a car for her 25th birthday, but insisted she drive it only when accompanied by him. Or, if he was unavailable, by a life-sized inflatable plastic replica of him, with its knees bent in a permanent sitting position. Now, nobody will fuck with you when you're driving alone, he explained triumphantly. Year upon year, Phil's jealousy increased. He trapped Ronnie in their house, surrounding it with barbed wire and guard dogs, and confiscating her shoes to prevent her from running away. Furthermore, he threatened to have her murdered if ever she tried to escape. I'm completely prepared for that day, he told her mother. I've already got her coffin. It's solid gold, and it's got a glass top so I can keep my eye on her after she's dead. At the same time, on their UK tour, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones had fallen in love with Ronnie. Keith used to say, oh, we would have great babies because you have that black, thick hair, and I have black, thick hair. On the 5th of February, Tony Hall threw another party at his Green Street flat, this time for the Beatles, who were set to embark on their first U.S. tour. It was a very sweet evening, recalls one person there that night, because the Beatles, as big as they were at the time, had no idea what was about to hit them when they went to America. So they were very apprehensive. Everyone danced along to Martha and the Vandellas' Heat Wave, and Ronnie joined in the singing at the top of her voice. Ronnie was the bird everyone wanted to shag, remembers Tony Calder, a music PR. Everybody was salivating over this incredible little thing. Meanwhile, he saw Phil Spector getting very wound up about the attention everybody was paying to Ronnie. You could feel the sexual tension. Every guy in the place looking at her because she was exotic and she was American. Phil's jealousy rocketed still further when he heard from Ronnie's mother John had invited the Ronettes to fly to America with the Beatles. Ronnie hadn't had the nerve to tell Phil about their generous offer, so she had asked her mother to broach the topic. You know, Phil, it might be good publicity if the girls went back on the jet with the Beatles. No, I've already bought their tickets. The Ronettes flew back to New York the next day without the Beatles. Phil told Ronnie he would make his own way back. Now, Chapter 41. Ronnie was back home with her mother and sister in Spanish Harlem watching TV coverage of the Beatles arriving at JFK when she happened to recognize a familiar figure on the screen. I almost fainted when I looked at the TV and saw Phil Spector following the Beatles out of their plane. I wanted to strangle him. Having wheedled his way on board the Beatles' plane, Spector had proved a tricky passenger. He's mad as a hatter, observed Ringo. We realized how crazy he was because he walked to America. He was so nervous of flying, he couldn't sit down, so we watched him walk up and down the length of the plane all day. By the time their plane touched down in New York, I Want to Hold Your Hand was #1 on the Billboard charts, and the pre-orders for merchandise were rolling in. Half a ton of Beatles wigs were following them to America, as well as 24,000 rolls of Beatles wallpaper. After a press conference at the airport, the Beatles were driven to the Plaza Hotel. Asterisk, footnote. In her autobiography, I gotta read that, Ronnie states that it was the Warwick Hotel, but on their first visit to the U.S., the Beatles stayed at the Plaza, transferred to the Delmonico on their next visit in August of that same year, after the Plaza, upset by the mayhem, refused to have them back. Nor does it mention the presence of John's wife, Cynthia, even though Cynthia had flown out with him. Albert Goldman, one of John's least reliable biographers, states boldly that as soon as Cynthia's back was turned, he hustled Ronnie into an adjoining bedroom. It is possible that Ronnie has got her dates muddled, and John's failed seduction took place at the Delmonico. The Beatles didn't stay at the Warwick until 1966. They were shepherded past thousands of fans who were screaming, "We want the Beatles!" John and George took the trouble to leave the names of the Ronettes with hotel security. Ronnie and Estelle were ushered upstairs together with their cousin Nedra, the third member of the group, and Nedra's boyfriend, Scott. For once, Phil Spector had taken his eye off the ball. While Ronnie was out having fun, he was busy in the studio. The Beatles had an entire floor of the hotel to themselves. Every surface groaned with sandwiches and alcohol. "We're prisoners up here, so they have to feed us well," explained John. In every room, there was a television switched on, but with the sound turned down. Record players were dotted about, with singles scattered all over the floor. "I love America," said John. "People here just bring you anything you want." Estelle and Ronnie sat on the floor with George and John, playing records and chatting. As it grew dark, Ronnie noticed that many of the original visitors had started to leave, and a lot of new guests were arriving, most of them young ladies with very short skirts. You didn't have to be a genius to figure out that a whole new kind of scene was about to start. Mal Evans was going around to the remainder of the first batch of guests, telling them it was time to go. "Don't worry, Scott's with us," said Ronnie. "We don't know him, Ronnie," replied John. "He's got to leave." "In that case," said Estelle, she was leaving too. She tried to encourage Ronnie to come with her, but as the group's name suggests, Ronnie was always the most forward of the Ronettes. If weird things were going to happen up here, I didn't want to miss them. The remaining guests started flocking into one of the bedrooms. John grabbed Ronnie's hand. "Come on, don't you want to see what's so interesting?" The bedroom was, to Ronnie's eyes, abnormally crowded. Everyone had gathered around in a circle. A man was standing on a chair taking photographs of whatever was going on in the center. When people spotted John with Ronnie, they made way for them. Ronnie looked on aghast. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. This girl was laying on the bed, and one of the guys in the Beatles' entourage was having sex with her right in front of all these people.
An obvious reason for this is the highly personal aspect of venereal disease.
And from the look on her face, she didn't seem to mind being used as entertainment at a Beatles party, even though none of them were even taking part. I guess it was enough to just be in the same hotel suite as them, as if that gave her something to tell her grandchildren. I hope not. The man and the woman kept at it, having sex every which way, while the photographer snapped away. For Ronnie, it was an education. She was still a virgin, and furthermore, she always made a point of keeping her underwear on in bed, just to be on the safe side, though she knew the basic details. I didn't know the first thing about doing 69 or any of these other variations. This was 1964, and you couldn't even get films with that stuff on them. And here was an actual girl having naked sex in every different position. That was a scene I'll never forget. She was so nonplussed by the goings-on in front of her that she couldn't help emitting, "Oh my God!" involuntary exclamations. Before long, John leaned over and whispered, "Ronnie, could you do that a little quieter, please?" As the floor show continued, Ronnie helped himself to the only armchair in, As the floor show continued, John helped himself to the only armchair in the room and encouraged Ronnie to sit on his lap. His excitement was all too tangible. That's a phrase. I may have been dumb back then, but I knew when it was time to get up off a guy's lap. She left the room. John followed her, and they went into his bedroom. He pointed to the Manhattan skyline and asked if she remembered the time they looked out of a window in London. Then Ronnie sat down, and John stood behind her, rubbing her neck with his hands. Ronnie said she had to tell him something. Not now, he said. She said she must. He said he knew all about her and Phil. I just thought you and I might have something too. Ronnie stood up. She loved talking to him about music, she said, but sometimes a guy can seem more like a brother than a boyfriend, and that's the way I think of you. I adore you, John, but not the way you want. As she left the room, John slammed the door behind her. But when he phoned her the next day, he behaved as though nothing had happened. Was she free that evening? The Beatles wanted to get away from it all and try some real New York food. And so the three Ronettes enjoyed a quiet night out with the four Beatles at Sherman's Barbecue in Harlem on 151st in Amsterdam. In future, whenever Ronnie dropped by Sherman's, the manager would greet her with a smile. I remember you. You're the little girl that brought the Beatles.